I arrived at Thornwood Hall on a November evening when the fog clung to the moors like a shroud, and the moment I stepped from the carriage, I felt the house watching me. Something in its dark windows, in the way the ivy crawled up its stone walls, whispered that I was not welcome here, that I should turn back before it was too late. But I could not turn back. I had nowhere else to go. My name is Eleanor Ashton, and I was 24 years old when I took the position as governess to the children of the Earl of Ashford. My previous employer had dismissed me after a scandal I did not cause, a whisper of impropriety that spread through drawing rooms like poison. No respectable family would hire me after that. When the letter came from Thornwood Hall, written in a precise, businesslike hand, offering generous wages and asking no questions about my references, I knew it was my only chance. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crowley, met me at the door. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that assessed me as one might assess a piece of furniture, deciding whether it would serve or disappoint. She said nothing about my late arrival, only gestured for me to follow her inside. The entrance hall was vast and cold. Portraits lined the walls, faces from generations past, staring down with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to melancholy resignation. Candles flickered in wall sconces, casting shadows that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at them. The air smelled of beeswax and something else, something faint and sweet, like roses left too long in a vase. Mrs. Crowley led me up a winding staircase, her keys jangling at her waist. She told me the rules as we walked. I was to take my meals in the nursery with the children. I was not to wander the house after dark. I was to speak to his lordship only when directly addressed. I was to keep the children quiet and occupied, away from the east wing, away from the library after sunset, away from their father unless summoned. I asked her why. She stopped on the landing and turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something like pity in her eyes. "Because his lordship is in mourning," she said, "and this house is not kind to those who disturb its ghosts." She showed me to my room, a small chamber at the end of a narrow corridor. The wallpaper was faded, pale blue with white flowers, and the bed was narrow but clean. A washstand stood in the corner, and a single window looked out over the grounds. I could see the line of trees in the distance, black against the darkening sky, and beyond them, the blur of the moors. Mrs. Crowley left me to unpack. I lit the candle on the bedside table and opened my trunk, taking out my few belongings: 2 dresses, a shawl, a book of poetry my mother had given me before she died, a silver locket with her portrait inside. I held the locket for a moment, feeling the weight of it in my palm, wishing she could tell me whether I had made the right choice in coming here. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I thought at first I had imagined it, a woman's voice, singing. The melody was soft and mournful, the words indistinct, but it seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house, echoing through the walls. I opened my door and stepped into the corridor. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more, only the distant ticking of a clock and the whisper of wind against the windows. I told myself it was a servant, or perhaps one of the children. I told myself I was tired from the journey, that my nerves were overwrought. But as I closed the door and returned to my unpacking, I could not shake the feeling that something in this house had taken notice of me. The next morning, I met the children. There were 2 of them, Isabel, who was 8, and Thomas, who was 6. Mrs. Crowley brought them to the nursery after breakfast, and they stood before me with solemn faces, studying me as though I were a curiosity they could not quite understand. Isabel had her father's dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that seemed too old for her small face. Thomas had lighter hair, almost golden in the morning light, and freckles across his nose. He held his sister's hand tightly, and I noticed that he would not look directly at me, only at the floor. I knelt down so that I was at their level. I told them my name. I told them I was here to teach them, to read with them, to help them learn. I told them I hoped we would be friends. Isabel tilted her head, considering me. Then she asked, in a voice that was both polite and strangely detached, whether I had seen the lady yet. I did not understand. I asked her what lady she meant. "The lady in white," she said, She walks the corridors at night. She sings sometimes. Thomas is afraid of her. But I am not. I think she is sad." Thomas tugged at his sister's hand, his eyes wide. Isabel squeezed his fingers and said nothing more. Mrs. Crowley, who had been standing by the door, cleared her throat sharply. "The children have very active imaginations, Miss Ashton," she said. "You must not encourage such fancies." But I had heard the singing. I had heard it with my own ears. I did not argue with Mrs. Crowley, but I looked at Isabel, and I saw in her eyes that she knew I did not disbelieve her. That afternoon, I took the children to the library to begin their lessons. It was a beautiful room, lined floor to ceiling with books, with tall windows that let in the pale autumn light. A fire burned in the hearth, and the air smelled of leather and old paper. I felt, for the first time since arriving, a sense of peace. We were reading together, Isabel stumbling over the longer words while Thomas traced pictures in the margins, when the door opened. I looked up, and my breath caught in my throat. The Earl of Ashford stood in the doorway. He was tall, perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore black, as befitted a man in mourning, and his expression was distant, unreadable. There was a hardness to his features, a tension in the line of his jaw, as though he carried a weight that could never be set down. But it was his eyes that held me. They were intelligent, searching, and for a moment, as his gaze met mine, I felt something pass between us, something I could not name, something that made my heart beat faster and my hands tremble against the pages of the book. He did not speak to me. He looked at the children and asked, in a voice that was low and measured, whether they were behaving. Isabel nodded. Thomas said nothing, only pressed closer to his sister. The Earl's gaze returned to me. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt as though he were seeing not just my face, but something deeper, something I had kept hidden even from myself. Then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal, and left the room. I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, trying to steady myself. Isabel was watching me with that too knowing expression, and I wondered what she saw. That night, I could not sleep. The house was full of sounds, the creak of floorboards, the rattle of windows, the sigh of wind through the chimneys. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. And then, just past midnight, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my room. They were slow, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who walked without fear of being heard. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened as they passed my door and continued down the hall. Then they stopped. There was a long silence, and then I heard a man's voice, low and anguished, speaking a single word, "Violet." It was the Earl. I knew his voice, and I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that he was speaking to someone who was not there, or perhaps someone who should not have been there. I rose from my bed and went to the window. The grounds below were silver with moonlight, and I could see the line of the garden, the shapes of statues and hedges, and beyond them, the dark mass of the woods. And then I saw her, a woman in white standing at the edge of the garden. She was too far away for me to see her face, but I could see the pale shape of her gown, the way it moved in the wind. She stood perfectly still, looking up at the house. Looking, I thought, directly at my window. I pressed my hand against the glass, my breath fogging the pain. And as I watched, the woman turned and walked into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I did not sleep again that night. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the shadows retreat and the sky turn pale. And I knew, with a fear and a fascination I could not separate, that I had come to a place where the dead did not rest, where the past refused to release its hold, and where my own heart was in terrible danger, because I had seen the way the Earl looked at me, and I had felt, despite every warning, despite every rule of propriety and sense, the first stirrings of something I had no right to feel: desire. The days at Thornwood Hall settled into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm built on unease and unspoken things. I taught the children their lessons in the morning, walked with them in the garden in the afternoon when the weather permitted, and read to them in the nursery before bed. They were intelligent children, hungry for knowledge and attention, and I found myself growing fond of them despite the strangeness that surrounded us all. But the nights were another matter. Every night I heard the footsteps in the corridor. Every night I heard the Earl's voice, low and filled with a grief that made my chest ache, speaking that single name, Violet. And twice more I saw the woman in white standing at the edge of the garden, always at the same spot, always looking up at the house before vanishing into the woods. I asked Mrs. Crowley about the previous countess. The housekeeper's face became a mask, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She told me only that the countess had died 2 years ago, that it had been a terrible tragedy, and that his lordship did not speak of it. When I pressed her, asking how the countess had died, Mrs. Crowley turned away and said that some questions were better left unasked, but Isabel had no such reservations. One afternoon, as we sat in the nursery and Thomas played with his wooden soldiers, she looked up from her embroidery and said quite calmly that her mother had fallen from the window of the East Wing Tower. I set down the book I had been reading. I asked her gently if she remembered her mother. Isabel nodded. She said her mother had been beautiful and sad, that she had worn perfume that smelled like roses, that she had spent hours locked in her rooms, that sometimes they could hear her crying through the doors. She said that on the night her mother died, there had been a terrible argument. She had heard her father's voice, raised in anger and desperation, and then a scream, and then silence. Thomas had stopped playing. He was staring at his sister with wide, frightened eyes. Isabel reached over and took his hand, her small face solemn. "Papa did not hurt Mama," she said, as though she needed to convince herself as much as me. "But something did. Something in this house." I did not know what to say to that. I pulled both children close and told them a story about a brave princess and a kind knight trying to chase away the shadows that had crept into the room. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the familiar footsteps pass my door, I could not stop thinking about a woman who had been beautiful and sad, who had smelled of roses, who had fallen from a tower window while her husband's voice echoed through the halls. It was on the 5th night that everything changed. I woke to the sound of singing, the same voice I had heard on my first evening, soft and mournful. But this time, it was closer. It seemed to come from just outside my door. I rose from my bed, my hands shaking, and lit my candle. The flame flickered as though disturbed by a breath, and I steadied it with my palm. I opened the door. The corridor was dark, empty. The singing had stopped, but I could smell roses, strong and sweet, as though someone had just passed carrying an armful of them. I followed the scent down the corridor, my candle casting long shadows on the walls. I knew I should return to my room, that I was breaking Mrs. Crowley's rules, but something compelled me forward. The scent grew stronger as I reached the end of the hall, where a narrow staircase led upward into darkness. The east wing, the tower. I climbed the stairs. They were steep and dusty, as though no one had used them in years. Cobwebs caught in my hair, and my candle flame danced wildly. At the top of the stairs was a door, heavy and dark, slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room beyond was circular, clearly the base of the tower. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating furniture covered in white sheets, a writing desk, a vanity with a mirror that reflected nothing but shadows, and standing before one of the windows, her back to me, was the woman in white. I could not move. I could not breathe. She stood perfectly still, her gown pale as moonlight, her dark hair loose down her back, and then slowly she turned to face me. I saw her face. It was beautiful and terrible, with eyes that held an infinite sadness and lips that curved in what might have been a smile or a grimace of pain. She looked at me, and I felt her gaze pierce through me, searching, weighing, judging. Then she lifted one pale hand and pointed, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned. The Earl stood in the doorway. He was breathing hard, as though he had been running. His shirt was open at the collar, his hair disheveled. His eyes were wild with something that might have been fear or fury or grief. I could not tell which. He looked at me, then past me, into the room. His face went white. His lips moved, forming a single word. Violet. I turned back. The woman was gone. The room was empty. Only the scent of roses remained, fading slowly into the cold night air. The Earl crossed the room in 3 strides. He took my shoulders, his grip firm but not painful, and searched my face with desperate intensity. He asked me what I had seen, what she had shown me, whether she had spoken. I told him the truth. I told him I had seen a woman in white, that she had pointed at something, but that I did not know what it meant. I told him I could still smell roses. His hands dropped from my shoulders. He turned away, pressing his palms against the window frame, his head bowed. His voice, when he spoke, was so low I almost could not hear it. "She will not leave," he said. "She will not let me forget. God help me, I deserve this. I deserve all of it. I did not think." I crossed the room and placed my hand on his arm. I told him that whatever had happened, whatever burden he carried, he did not have to bear it alone. He turned to look at me then, and the expression in his eyes made my breath catch. It was gratitude and anguish, and something else, something that burned through the darkness between us. He lifted his hand and touched my cheek, his fingers gentle, trembling. He said my name, Eleanor, just that. But the way he said it, the longing and restraint in his voice, told me everything. We stood like that, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, could see the pulse beating at his throat. Every rule I had ever been taught, every lesson about propriety and distance, dissolved in that moment. I knew I should step back, should return to my room, should protect my reputation and my position. But I could not move. He leaned closer, and I thought he would kiss me. I wanted him to. God forgive me. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. But instead he dropped his hand and stepped away, his jaw tight with the effort of restraint. "You should not be here," he said. "This room is dangerous. The whole wing is dangerous. Promise me you will not come here again." I promised, though I did not know if I could keep it. He escorted me back to my room, walking a careful distance behind me, saying nothing. At my door he stopped and looked at me one last time. He told me he was sorry, that I should never have been brought into this, that if I wished to leave Thornwood Hall, he would provide references and passage to anywhere I wanted to go. But I did not want to leave, not anymore. Not when I had seen the pain in his eyes, the loneliness that matched my own. Not when I had felt, for the first time in my life, that I was exactly where I was meant to be, even if it destroyed me. I told him I would stay. Something flickered in his expression. Relief or regret, I could not tell. He inclined his head and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. I knew I was a fool. I knew I was risking everything. But as I climbed back into my narrow bed and pulled the covers close, I also knew that I was no longer the same woman who had arrived at Thornwood Hall 6 days ago. I was no longer content to simply survive. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what had happened to Violet, why her spirit could not rest, what guilt the Earl carried that kept him walking these halls at night calling her name. And I wanted, God help me, to be the one who brought him peace. Even if it meant defying the boundaries of class and propriety, even if it meant facing whatever darkness haunted this house. The next morning, I began my own investigation. I began carefully, asking questions that seemed innocent. I asked the cook about the household before I arrived, about whether the children had been happy, about what the Countess had been like. The cook was a kindly woman named Mrs. Patterson, and she spoke freely while kneading bread, her hands white with flour. The Countess had been troubled, she said, beautiful but fragile, like a flower that blooms too early and cannot survive the frost. She had come to Thornwood Hall as a bride at 18, full of hope and life, but something in the house had changed her. She became withdrawn, fearful. She claimed she heard voices, that she saw things in mirrors that were not there. The Earl had brought doctors, specialists from London, but nothing helped. And then, one terrible night, she had gone to the tower and thrown herself from the window. I asked whether anyone believed it had truly been suicide. Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled in the dough. She looked at me with troubled eyes and said that the Earl had been questioned, that there had been whispers, but that nothing could be proven. The Countess's maid had heard them arguing that night, had heard the Earl begging Violet not to do something, and then the scream, and then silence. But what had he been begging her not to do? Mrs. Patterson did not know. The maid had left Thornwood Hall the next day and never returned. I thanked her and continued my lessons with the children, but my mind was racing. That afternoon, when the Earl came to the library to check on our progress, I felt his gaze linger on me longer than necessary. When he asked how I was settling in, his voice held a warmth that had not been there before, a softness that made my pulse quicken. I told him I was well. I told him the children were doing beautifully with their studies. I did not tell him that I had been asking questions, that I was trying to piece together what had happened to his wife. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he did something unexpected. He asked if I would join him for tea that afternoon, in the drawing room, after the children's lessons were finished. It was inappropriate. A governess did not take tea with her employer, but I agreed before I could think better of it. That afternoon, I changed into my better dress, a simple gray wool with a white collar, and pinned my hair more carefully than usual. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just tea, just a conversation. But I knew it was more than that. I knew I was stepping across a line that could never be uncrossed. The drawing room was warm and elegant, with a fire burning in the hearth and afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The Earl stood when I entered, and I saw that he too had changed, though he still wore black. He gestured to a chair near the fire and poured tea with his own hands, an intimacy that would have shocked any proper household. We spoke of small things at first, the children's progress, the weather, the gardens. But beneath the polite words, there was a current of something else, a tension that made the air between us feel charged, dangerous. Then he set down his cup and looked at me directly. He told me he owed me an explanation for what I had witnessed in the tower. He told me that his wife had been haunted, not by a ghost, but by something in her own mind, a darkness that had consumed her slowly. He told me he had failed to save her, that he had watched her slip away and could do nothing, and that her death was his burden to bear. I asked him gently whether he believed the house was truly haunted, whether he thought Violet's spirit remained. His jaw tightened. He said he did not know what he believed anymore. He said that since her death he had seen things that defied explanation, heard her voice in empty rooms, felt her presence watching him. He said he did not know if it was guilt manifesting as madness, or if something in Thornwood Hall truly held her spirit captive. I leaned forward, drawn by his pain and his honesty. I told him that whatever the truth, he was not alone in experiencing it. I told him I had seen her too, that I had felt her presence, that I believed something in this house was trying to communicate, to reveal something that had been hidden. He looked at me then with such intensity that I felt stripped bare, as though he could see every secret I had ever kept, every longing I had ever hidden. He told me I should leave, that it was not safe for me, that he could not bear the thought of something happening to me because of his cursed house and his cursed past. But I told him I would not leave. I told him I was not afraid. That was a lie. I was terrified, but not of the ghost. I was afraid of the way my heart raced when he looked at me, of the way I wanted to reach across the small distance between us and touch his hand, of the way I was beginning to realize that what I felt was not mere sympathy or curiosity, but something far more dangerous. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to me. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion. He said that I deserved better than this, than a broken man in a haunted house, than a scandal that would ruin me if anyone learned I had been alone with him like this. I rose and crossed the room. I stood beside him, close enough that I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the window frame. I told him that I had already been ruined once by scandal I did not cause, that my reputation was already lost, that I had nothing left to protect except the truth. He turned to face me. We were so close, I could feel the heat of him, could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines of grief etched around his eyes. He lifted his hand slowly, as though giving me time to step away, and touched my face with a tenderness that made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. He whispered my name, like a prayer, Eleanor, and then he kissed me. It was not the gentle, restrained kiss of a gentleman. It was desperate, hungry, the kiss of a man who had been alone too long, who had held himself back too long. I responded without thinking, my arms going around his neck, my body pressing against his. All my life I had been taught to be modest, controlled, invisible, but in that moment, in his arms, I felt alive for the first time. When he pulled away, we were both breathing hard. He pressed his forehead to mine, his hands still cradling my face. He told me he was sorry, that he should not have done that he had no right. But I told him I was glad he had. God help me, I told him the truth. We stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the fire crackling behind us, and the afternoon light fading into dusk. And then, from somewhere above us, we heard it, a woman's voice, singing. The same mournful melody I had heard before, but this time the words were clear. Remember, remember, the truth lies below, where roses grow wild and the cold waters flow. The Earl went rigid. He stepped back from me, his face pale. He said that Violet used to sing that song, that it was something her mother had taught her as a child. He said he had not heard it since the night she died. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked him what the words meant, about truth and roses and cold water. He shook his head. He said he did not know, that Violet had never explained it. But his eyes held a flicker of something, recognition or fear, I could not tell which. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. The Earl told me I should return to my room, that it was growing late, that we had already risked too much. But as I turned to leave, he caught my hand and held it for a moment, his grip tight and warm. He told me to be careful. He told me that whatever was happening in Thornwood Hall, whatever Violet was trying to tell us, it might be dangerous to uncover. He told me that if I discovered anything at all, I was to come to him immediately. I promised I would. But as I left the drawing room and climbed the stairs to my room, the words of the song echoed in my mind. Where roses grow wild and the cold waters flow. I thought of the rose garden I had seen from my window, overgrown and neglected. I thought of the small lake beyond the woods, dark and still. And I knew that tomorrow, while the Earl was away on estate business and the children were occupied with their afternoon rest, I would go searching for whatever truth lay hidden there. Even if it meant confronting the ghost who sang in the darkness. Even if it meant discovering something that would change everything. Because I could no longer turn away. Not from the mystery. And not from the man who had kissed me, as though I were the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the dark. The next afternoon, while the children napped and the Earl was away meeting with his tenants, I slipped out of the house through the servants' entrance. The November air was cold and damp, heavy with the promise of rain. I pulled my shawl tight around my shoulders and made my way toward the rose garden. It was more overgrown than I had realized from my window. The roses had grown wild, their thorny branches tangling together into an impenetrable wall in places. Many were still blooming despite the lateness of the season, their petals pale pink and white, browning at the edges. The scent was overwhelming, sweet and slightly rotten, the smell of beauty dying slowly. I walked the perimeter of the garden, searching for anything unusual, a marker, a disturbed patch of earth, anything that might explain Violet's cryptic song. The cold waters flow. I looked beyond the garden to where I could see the lake through the trees, dark and still as a mirror. That was when I saw it. A stone marker, half hidden by rose bushes, worn smooth by weather and time. I pushed aside the thorny branches, ignoring the scratches on my hands, and knelt to read the inscription. Here lies beloved companion and faithful friend. May she rest in peace where roses bloom eternal. It was not a human grave. This was a marker for a pet, perhaps a dog or cat. But something about it troubled me. The phrasing was odd, almost deliberately vague. And beneath the inscription, so faint I almost missed it, was a single word carved in a different hand, rougher and more recent. Forgive. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I stood and looked toward the lake, remembering the words. Where roses grow wild and the cold waters flow. If the rose garden was one part of the message, then the lake must be the other. I made my way through the woods, following a narrow path that wound between ancient oaks and elms. Their branches were bare now, reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. Leaves crunched beneath my feet, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out, harsh and mocking. The lake appeared suddenly, opening before me like a wound in the earth. It was larger than I had thought, its surface black and smooth, reflecting nothing but the heavy clouds above. Reeds grew along the edges, brown and brittle, and the air smelled of decay and stagnant water. I walked along the shore, my boots sinking into the soft mud. I did not know what I was searching for, only that I would know it when I found it. And then I saw the small stone structure, almost hidden by undergrowth. It was a folly, the kind wealthy families built for decoration, shaped like a miniature Greek temple with 3 crumbling walls and a collapsed roof. I approached carefully. The structure was old, neglected, covered in moss and ivy. But inside, protected from the weather, I found something that made my blood run cold. A writing desk, rotted and warped by damp. A chair tipped on its side. And scattered across the stone floor, dozens of letters, their ink faded, but still legible. I knelt and picked one up with shaking hands. It was addressed to the Earl, but it had never been sealed, never been sent. The handwriting was elegant but erratic, the words running together in places as though written in great distress. "My dearest love," it began, "I cannot continue this pretense. I cannot bear the weight of what we have done. Every night I hear her voice calling to me from the water, accusing me, condemning me. You said no one would ever know, but she knows. God help me, she knows." I read another and another. They were all the same, variations on a theme of guilt and confession. References to a terrible secret, to something that had happened at the lake, to a person whose name was never written, but whose presence haunted every line. And then I found the final letter, dated the night Violet died. I am going to tell him everything. I cannot live with this poison inside me anymore. I know you will hate me for it, that he will hate me, that I will lose everything I have ever loved. But it is the only way she will stop haunting me. The only way I can find peace. If you are reading this and I am gone, know that I loved you both and that I am sorry. Forgive me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the letter. I read it again, trying to make sense of it. Violet had been having an affair. She had been racked with guilt over it, and she had planned to confess everything to her husband the night she died. But who had she been writing to? And who was the person haunting her, calling to her from the water? I gathered the letters carefully, tucking them inside my shawl. I needed to show them to the Earl, needed to help him understand what had driven his wife to such despair. But as I turned to leave the folly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around. A man stood at the entrance, blocking my way. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, with fair hair and cold blue eyes. I had never seen him before, but something in the way he looked at me, with recognition and barely concealed malice, made my heart race with fear. He told me I should not have come here. He told me I was meddling in things I did not understand, that I was just like Violet, too curious for my own good. I demanded to know who he was. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He introduced himself as Lord Ashford's cousin, Richard Ashford, and the estate's solicitor. He told me he had been away on business, but had returned that morning. He told me he had been watching me, had seen me question the servants, had seen me enter the drawing room alone with the Earl. He stepped closer, and I backed against the desk. He said it would be a shame if word got out that the new governess was seducing her employer, just as the previous countess had seduced him. He said it would ruin whatever was left of the Earl's reputation, would harm the children, would ensure I never found respectable employment again. I told him I did not know what he meant, but even as I said it, the pieces were falling into place in my mind. The affair, the letters, the guilt that had consumed Violet. Richard's smile widened. He told me that Violet had been weak, emotional, susceptible to flattery and attention. He told me it had been easy to turn her head, to make her believe he cared for her, when really he had only wanted to hurt his cousin, to take something precious away from the man who had inherited everything. I felt sick. I asked him if the Earl knew. Richard laughed. He said the Earl had never suspected a thing, that Violet had been planning to confess that night, but that he had stopped her. He told me he had gone to her rooms, had begged her not to speak, had followed her to the tower. He told me they had argued at the window, that she had threatened to scream for help, and that in the struggle she had fallen. It was not suicide. It was not murder. It was a terrible accident born of guilt and panic and lies. I stared at him in horror. I asked him why he was telling me this, why he would confess such a thing. He stepped even closer, so close I could smell the brandy on his breath. He told me because no one would believe me if I told them that I was nothing, a ruined governess with no references and no future. He told me that if I spoke a word of this to anyone, he would ensure I was accused of theft, of seduction, of any number of crimes that would see me imprisoned or worse. But he had miscalculated, because at that moment another voice spoke from behind him. Step away from her. The Earl stood at the entrance to the folly. His face was white with rage, his hands clenched into fists. He told Richard to get away from me, to leave his property immediately, or he would kill him where he stood. Richard tried to bluster, to deny, but the Earl had heard everything. He had followed me to the lake, concerned for my safety, and had arrived in time to hear his cousin's confession. What happened next was swift and violent. The Earl grabbed Richard by his coat and dragged him out of the folly. There was a struggle, shouts, the sound of fists striking flesh. I ran after them and saw the Earl throw his cousin to the ground, standing over him with murder in his eyes. But he did not strike again. He simply told Richard that he had 1 hour to leave Thornwood Hall, and that if he ever returned, if he ever came near his children or me or anyone the Earl loved, he would ensure the truth of what happened to Violet was known to everyone. Richard staggered to his feet, blood running from his nose. He spat a curse and stumbled away through the trees. The Earl turned to me, the rage drained from his face, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He asked if I was hurt, if Richard had touched me. I shook my head, still trembling, and handed him the letters. He read them there by the lake, his face growing paler with each word. When he finished, he sank onto a fallen log and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and I realized he was weeping. I sat beside him and took his hand. I told him it was not his fault, that he could not have known. I told him that Violet had loved him, that her guilt had come from betraying that love. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. He told me he had failed her, that he had been so consumed with managing the estate, with his duties and obligations, that he had not seen how lonely she was, how vulnerable. He told me he would carry that failure for the rest of his life. I held him as he wept, there in the cold November afternoon beside the dark water. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever scandal or consequence awaited us, I loved him. Not just with desire, but with the deep, aching love that sees all of someone's brokenness and chooses them anyway. When his tears subsided, he pulled back and looked at me. He told me he was going to send the children to his sister's house in London, that Thornwood Hall was no place for them anymore. He told me I should go with them, that I could not stay here with him, that it would destroy us both. But I told him no. I told him I would stay until he no longer needed me. I told him I would help him find peace, help him heal, even if it meant sacrificing my own future. He kissed me then, soft and desperate, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow. And as we held each other beside the haunted lake, I felt the air around us shift. The oppressive weight that had hung over Thornwood Hall lifted slightly, as though something that had been trapped was finally beginning to let go. Violet's spirit, I thought, had been waiting for the truth, and now that the truth was known, perhaps she could finally rest. That night, for the first time since I had arrived at Thornwood Hall, the house was silent. No footsteps echoed in the corridors. No voice called out in anguish. No woman in white stood at the edge of the garden. It was as though the very walls had released their held breath and settled into peace. The Earl arranged for the children to travel to London within the week. Isabel cried when I told her I would not be accompanying them, clinging to my skirts with a desperation that broke my heart. But I promised her it was not forever, that I would see her again, and eventually she let me go. Thomas said nothing, only pressed a small wooden horse into my hand, one of his favorite toys. When I tried to return it, he shook his head and told me to keep it, so I would remember him. I held him close and promised I would never forget. After they left, Thornwood Hall felt enormous and empty. The servants whispered among themselves, uncertain about the future. Mrs. Crowley asked me directly if I intended to stay, and I saw in her eyes that she knew, or suspected, what had grown between the Earl and me. I told her I would stay as long as I was needed. She nodded slowly and said nothing more, but her expression held something that might have been approval or pity, I could not tell which. The Earl spent his days settling his affairs, meeting with his steward and his remaining advisors. Richard had fled to the continent, I learned, and would not be returning. The scandal had been contained, the truth known only to a few trusted servants who would carry it to their graves. But at night, when the house was dark and still, the Earl would come to the library where I sat, reading by the fire. We did not speak much. We did not need to. He would sit across from me, and we would simply exist in each other's presence, two damaged souls finding solace in shared silence. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the children had left, he finally spoke of what we both had been avoiding. He told me that he cared for me deeply, more deeply than he had any right to. He told me that if circumstances were different, if he were not a widower still in mourning, if I were not his employee, he would court me properly, would offer me everything he had. But circumstances were not different. And we both knew what the world would say if a grieving Earl married his children's governess mere months after the truth of his wife's death had been uncovered. It would destroy what remained of his reputation. It would taint the children's futures. It would reduce me to nothing more than a scheming opportunist in the eyes of society. I told him I understood. I told him I had known from the beginning that what we felt for each other had no future, that I had accepted that truth even as I had allowed myself to love him. He crossed the room and knelt before my chair, taking my hands in his. He told me he would not ask me to wait for him, that it would be unfair and cruel. He told me he would help me find a new position, somewhere far from here, somewhere I could start fresh with proper references and a generous settlement that would ensure I never had to worry about money again. It was the right thing to do, the proper thing, the only thing that made sense. But I could not bear it. I told him that I did not want to leave, that I did not care about propriety or reputation or what society thought. I told him that I had spent my entire life being proper and cautious, and it had brought me nothing but loneliness and loss. I told him that I would rather have 1 year of happiness with him, even if it meant scandal and ruin, than a lifetime of respectable emptiness without him. He looked at me with such anguish and longing that I thought my heart would break. He told me he could not let me sacrifice everything for him, that he loved me too much to allow it, and that was when I understood. He did love me. He loved me enough to let me go, to protect me even from himself. But I was not so noble. I was not so selfless. I leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sure, and told him that it was not his choice to make. I told him that my life was my own, that I had already been ruined once by scandal I did not cause, and that if I were to be ruined again, I would do it on my own terms, for my own reasons, with the man I loved. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me as though I were something precious and fragile that might shatter if he let go. He buried his face in my hair and whispered that he did not deserve me, that I was far too good for him. I told him that was not true. I told him we were both broken in our own ways, both haunted by our pasts, and that perhaps that was why we understood each other so well. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, while outside the November wind rattled the windows and the first snow of winter began to fall. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. I woke to find a letter on my bedside table, written in an elegant hand I did not recognize. There was no signature, no indication of who had left it there. But as I read it, I felt a chill run down my spine. Thank you for finding the truth. Thank you for loving him when I could not. Be happy, Eleanor. You have freed us both. I knew, without question, that it was from Violet. One final message from beyond, a benediction and a farewell. I held the letter to my heart and wept, not from fear, but from a strange, profound gratitude. I showed it to the Earl over breakfast. He read it in silence, then carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. He told me that he had dreamed of Violet the night before, that she had appeared to him not as the tortured spirit who haunted the halls, but as she had been when they first married, young and smiling and at peace. She had told him to let her go, to forgive himself, to live. And so we made our decision. We would wait 1 year, a proper mourning period, and then we would marry quietly, away from London, away from the eyes of society. The children would return to Thornwood Hall, and I would become not just their governess, but their stepmother. There would be talk, certainly, but we would weather it together. It was not a perfect solution. It was not without risk or cost, but it was ours, and it was real, and it was built on truth and love and the courage to choose happiness over fear. The snow fell heavier as the day went on, covering the grounds in white, transforming Thornwood Hall into something clean and new. That evening, the Earl and I walked through the rose garden together. The roses were dormant now, their thorny branches bare beneath the snow, but come spring, they would bloom again, wild and beautiful and unstoppable. We stood at the place where I had found the marker, where Violet's cryptic message had led me to the truth. The Earl placed his hand over mine and told me that he was going to have a proper memorial erected for Violet. Something beautiful and honest that acknowledged both her life and her struggles. I told him I thought that was right. I told him that everyone deserved to be remembered with compassion, even in their darkest moments. As we turned to walk back to the house, I looked up at the tower window where Violet had fallen. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure standing there, watching us. But when I blinked, there was nothing, only the reflection of snow and sky in the glass. The haunting was over. The truth had been told, and Violet's spirit, bound so long by guilt and secrets and unfinished business, had finally found its rest. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the wind and the silence, I thought about all that had happened since I had arrived at Thornwood Hall. I had come here broken and desperate, with nothing to my name but a scandalous reputation and a small trunk of belongings. I had expected loneliness, isolation, perhaps a few months of respectable employment before being dismissed again. Instead, I had found mystery and terror and truth. I had found children who needed me, a house that challenged me, and secrets that demanded to be uncovered. And I had found love, fierce and unexpected and transformative, with a man as damaged and hopeful as myself. I had learned that I was not weak or worthless, that I had courage and intelligence and the capacity to fight for what I believed in. I had learned that love was not always convenient or proper or safe, but that it was worth pursuing anyway, worth risking everything for. And I had learned that even the dead could forgive, could let go, could find peace if only the living were brave enough to face the truth. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard the faintest whisper of a voice, so soft it might have been only the wind. "Thank you." And then silence, complete and final. I smiled in the darkness and closed my eyes. Tomorrow the Earl and I would begin planning our future. Tomorrow we would write to the children and tell them they would soon have a home again. Tomorrow we would start the slow work of healing and rebuilding. But tonight, in this moment, I allowed myself simply to rest, to feel the weight of everything I had survived and everything I had gained, to know that I was exactly where I was meant to be, in a haunted house that had become home, with a love that had been forbidden but was now finally ours to claim, and with a future that stretched before us, uncertain and difficult perhaps, but filled with possibility and hope. The ghosts of Thornwood Hall had been laid to rest, and in their place, new life was beginning to bloom,